We all need to pray for each other right now. And I appreciate all of you who've been praying for me regarding my health. About 2 months ago, I went to visit my surgeon, and unfortunately, I discovered that where she had surgically removed the lymph nodes last year, that I have some new tumors growing there, and on the right side, I have some lymph nodes that have enlarged. And she told me that we would have to do surgery once again, and either chemotherapy or radiation beam. Needless to say, I was distressed. I asked God, what is next? And then he impressed me with faithfully applying the New Start principles and to entrust my health to him. And I shared this with many of you, and so many of you continue to pray for me, my family, and so many other people praying for me also. Well, shortly after this, I began to discover that my tumors were getting smaller. I have 4 tumors here that are palpable, and I discovered that they were getting smaller, and I was so grateful and excited that God was good. But then, I fractured my right ankle playing indoor soccer, and for 2.5 weeks, I had to mostly sit, keep my foot elevated because of the swelling. And sitting for 2.5 weeks, I developed sciatica pain. And then sleeping at night, trying to find a comfortable position with my foot and my sciatica was very difficult. I was unable to walk, to drive. And walking has been my therapy and inspiration. Then, in my humanity, I began to be concerned and worried about my cancer, because I was not walking anymore. I was not sleeping well. And I found myself grumbling and complaining. Why did this have to happen now? Why do I and others have to face so many challenges? Why is there so much suffering? You know, I remember as a child, whenever I injured myself, my mother would kiss my owie and would say that everything would get better. The gesture was nice, but the pain didn't disappear. If only it was that easy. Pain continues. It is unavoidable, indiscriminate, and at times ruthless. The first introduction into this world is a quick smack on the bum, and then pain becomes an accepted reality, not a welcomed one. Suffering, though, really isn't the problem. It's our perspective that characterizes whether it is good or bad. Chip Brogden states, "It is not a question of God allowing or not allowing things to happen. It is part of living. Some things we do to ourselves, other things we do to each other. Our Father knows about every bird which falls to the ground, but he does not always prevent it from falling." What are we to learn from this? That our response to what happens is more important than what happens. Here's a mystery. One man's experience drives him to curse God, while another man's identical experience drives him to bless God. Your response to what happens is more important than what happens. Perspective is everything. The doctor smacks a newborn child on its bum so it will cry and the lungs will expand. The mother may interpret the doctor as being cruel, but really he was doing the kindest things possible. For in so doing, the newborn's lungs were able to expand and breathe in air, life-giving air. So, as a newborn breathed in life-giving air, so we need to inhale God's wisdom to understand the reasons for suffering. Why pain and suffering? And is it possible that anything good can come from it? Suffering, unfortunately, is a result of sin. When God created man, he endowed him with freedom of choice. God determined that man would not be a puppet, but a free being who could choose him who is good. But with this freedom comes the inevitable results of choosing evil as well as good. This, unfortunately, was Adam and Eve's tragic story. Choosing evil, Satan's lies. God is selfish and a liar, and you can be God, the source and authority of good and truth. Adam and Eve, beguiled and afraid, then hid from God. They no longer felt safe in his presence because their damaged minds were darkened. Believing God was self-serving and untrustworthy, no longer trusting him, they only trusted in themselves. They severed themselves from God's goodness and truth, bringing sorrow and misery upon themselves, but not only upon themselves, upon their posterity, including you and me. We are all damaged because of sin. The Apostle Paul describes man's condition in Romans 3, verses 9 and 10. I invite you to turn your Bibles to Romans chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. We all are afflicted with this disease called sin. And in Romans 3, verses 9 and 10, the Apostle Paul describes this condition where he says, beginning verse 9, "There is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. Together they have become worthless." No one understands and appreciates God's goodness and truth. No one seeks him, but turns from him to foolish things perceived as good and true. Proverbs 14, verse 12, you're familiar with it, where it states, "There's a way that appears to be right, but the end, it leads to what? To death, pain, and suffering." Sin always robs us of God's loving care and truth. We are beguiled and enslaved to the devil's lies and service, oppressed by darkness and confusion, guilt and despair, misery and grief. We suffer, for sin has damaged us and our relationship with God. Another explanation for pain is that we live together in community, encountering good as well as evil. The Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 14, verse 7, "For none of us lives for ourselves alone, and none of us dies for ourselves alone." We all belong to families and communities, associations, and relationships that hopefully are good. Unfortunately, as you have discovered, this is not always the case, because all of us are damaged because of sin. We are selfish. Who defines what is good and right for the individual and the community? And how do you manage disagreements and conflicts? We previously read in Romans chapter 3 how sin has damaged us in our relationship with God. The next verses describes how sin has damaged our relationships with people, particularly those whom we disagree with, those whom we have conflicts with. Look at Romans chapter 3 once again in verses 11 and 12. Romans chapter 3, verses 11 and 12. Verses 13 to 16. It states here, "There is no one who shows kindness, not even one. Their throats are open graves. They deceive with their tongues. The poison of asps is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. When violated and injured, we rarely show compassion and kindness. Our mouths become weapons of justice for vengeance and retribution, to control and manipulate, injure and wound, to get what is good and right in our own eyes. This provokes anger, hostility, and bitterness. It damages hearts, shatters relationships, and divides communities. People suffer pain, misery, and grief. An unfortunate example of this happened last week in Laloche, Saskatchewan. You remember on the news, where a young man killed his two brothers at home and two teachers at school. He was described as an outcast at home and a victim of bullying at school. He felt victimized by injustice at home and in school, and tragically unleashed his anger by violently taking the lives of others. And now people suffer and a community is traumatized. When it was decided that man should live together upon the earth, it was inevitable that the innocent should sometimes suffer. But it also should be remembered that living together brings many of the most cherished blessings that mankind ever knows. The nature of the universe also explains human suffering. Our universe was designed as a uniform system of law and order. The seas provide moisture to the continents for all life to exist. However, in the same process, storms sometimes destroy houses and lives. One of man's greatest achievements was the production of the automobile. But along with its fine uses, there are also tragic ones when they take the lives of innocent people. Similarly, steel used for buildings can also be used for weapons which destroy lives in war. The principles of nature, if used properly, result in good. If used improperly, they damage and destroy, inflict with suffering and pain. Suffering is a result of sin, and because we live together in a world of law and order. But can any good come from suffering? God desires to reconcile sinful man to himself, to restore the broken relationship, and to heal the damaged heart. This being so, everything that takes man away from God is evil, and everything that brings him towards God is good. Accepting this standard, we view world events differently. Worldly riches, honors, and pleasures are actually hindrances rather than helps. Illness, loss of money, and even the loss of family and friends might ultimately serve some good purpose. Under certain circumstances, poverty is better than riches. All too often, the material things of our world blind us to the spiritual things and thus become curses instead of blessings. It depends on our attitude towards them, how we manage them. Do they draw us closer to God or pry us away from Him? Suffering may not be good in itself, but what is good is that suffering can create an openness and a turning to God. Chip Brogden states, blessings alone do not open our eyes. Indeed, blessings by themselves tend to close our eyes. We do not come to know God in the blessing, but in the breaking. Most people live as a chief end in life was their own bliss, freedom from pain or suffering or anything unpleasant. God, not sin, and Satan is tragically blamed for sin and suffering. Men search for an elusive paradise independent of God. But since God is the source and originator of all that is good and wise, it is possible that pain is his method to woo men back to himself, to restore a broken relationship, and to heal damaged hearts. The prodigal son is a classic example of this. He misinterpreted and rejected his father's wisdom and kindness, selfishly pursued his fantasy of freedom and pleasure. But his subsequent loss and suffering were the catalyst to restore him to his father and to find the love that he longed for. Angelina Jolie states, "Without pain, there would be no suffering. Without suffering, we would never learn from our mistakes. To make it right, pain and suffering is the key to all windows. Without it, there is no way of life." Suffering also has the power to beautify and ennoble the character and the spirit of the sufferer. Some people feel God's love secures anything they want. But this is completely unrealistic, for the Bible never describes God's love as frivolous and indulgent. God is described as a potter who carefully and painstakingly forms a shapeless clay into a vessel of honor. He is a father who gently disciplines and corrects his children. A human father who genuinely loves his children sometimes disciplines them, lest they injure and destroy themselves through their poor choices. Loving care involves discipline. If God offered immunity from suffering, it would rob his followers of the means of developing the beauty and strength of character he offers. Helen Keller states it well. Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved. In the book, until perfect humility fills the mind and the character is transformed, then they are victorious over self and in harmony with Christ and the Spirit of heaven. God repeats trials, increases the pressure and heat to expose hidden defects, hoping that we might humbly listen and detect that which is wrong, and courageously surrender flaws that separate us from him and eternity. I found myself complaining about my difficult circumstances, but when I stopped grumbling and chose to quietly listen, God revealed his good purpose for me in my discomfort. I was mistakenly placing more value on what I was doing for my health instead of on Christ, his presence, his promises, and his power to heal. It is so easy to become preoccupied with the tangible things that we can control instead of the unseen spiritual realities. On Thursday this week, I visited my endocrinologist to report on my progress. How do I share with him my spiritual journey with God? And invite an openness to accompany me in this venture together. After sharing what God has been doing for me, as I've been learning to cooperate with him, and also all the people that have been praying the future holds. The Bible describes our existence on earth as a temporary journey, preparing for a future, better and more a permanent abode in heaven. We read that Abraham looked for the city which has the foundations, whose builder and maker is God. The Apostle Paul said, "For our citizenship is in heaven." In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16 through 18, I'd like you to turn there. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. God speaking through the Apostle Paul once again says to us, "Therefore, do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. For now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. God has prepared a home for us and invites each one of us to come. Are you planning on being there? Amen. We might forget this greater destiny were it not for heartaches, disappointments, and sufferings of this world. They were tenderly designed in part to cause us not to be satisfied here, but to lift our eyes toward a better place. Jeremiah 29, verse 11. God says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans for good and not for harm, to give you a future and a hope." God's thoughts and plans for us are always for good, to provide hope and a good future. Suffering is his weighty gift, entrusted us to enable us to humbly and faithfully cooperate with him as he heals and restores us, fitting us for eternity. I like this quote from the book Desire of Ages, which affirms this, page 224. God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. Not Enoch, who was translated to heaven, not Elijah, who ascended in a chariot of fire, was greater or more honored than John the Baptist, who perished alone in the dungeon. And of all the gifts that heaven can bestow upon men, fellowship with Christ in his sufferings is the most weighty trust and the highest honor. Suffering happens. It is unavoidable. Perspective determines our response to it, whether good or bad. Suffering is the result of sin, and because we live together in a world of law and order. But God works through pain to bring us to himself, to mold and to shape us, to enable us to turn away from our sinful, superficial world and to seek him and his glorious eternal home.